Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks, 28 years in the air. Commercial, military, cargo, international. I've flown through monsoons over the South China Sea. I've landed blind in a whiteout in Oslo. I've talked a first-time flyer through a panic attack at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic while simultaneously navigating a hydraulic warning light. I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger a plane could carry. I was wrong. Tonight, I want to tell you what happened on Flight 1149, New York to Los Angeles, on a Tuesday in March that I will never forget for as long as I hold a license. By the time we touched down at LAX, one man had lost his job, one woman had told the truth for the first time in 11 years, and a 7-year-old girl had asked a question in the middle of a crowded first-class cabin that made grown adults go completely still. Let me take you back to the gate. JFK, Terminal 7, 6:40 in the evening. The kind of March night that can't decide what it wants to be. Cold enough for a coat, wet enough to ruin one, just miserable enough to make everyone boarding a plane feel like they've already earned something. Gate 32 was packed. Flight 1149 to Los Angeles was full, every seat assigned. The gate agent, a woman named Denise, had been working the JFK LAX corridor for 9 years. She could read a boarding situation the way a doctor reads a waiting room, who was going to be trouble before they reached the counter, who was going to need a little extra patience, who had a connection they were already convinced they were going to miss. She had already clocked the man in the gray suit. His name was Richard Callow, 51 years old, Senior VP of Content Acquisitions at a streaming company whose name you would recognize immediately. He was the kind of man who existed at a volume slightly louder than everyone around him, not shouting, just operating at a frequency that crowded out other sounds. His carry-on was designer. His watch cost more than Denise's car. He had the particular posture of someone who had been told, many times, that his time was more valuable than other people's time, and had decided to believe it completely. He was already at the priority lane before boarding was called. Denise watched him from the corner of her eye. Across the gate area, seated near the window with a carry-on bag between her feet and a 7-year-old asleep across her lap, was a woman named Camille Okafor, 38. She was a physical therapist from Brooklyn. She had the careful, unhurried movements of someone who carries other people's pain as part of their daily work, a steadiness in her hands, a patience in her face. She wore her hair natural, pulled back, and over her shoulders was a sweater that had been washed so many times it had softened into something that was less clothing and more comfort. The child on her lap was named Zoe, 7 years old. She was sleeping with absolute conviction, the way children sleep, completely, without reservation. In her arms, she held a worn, stuffed dog named Biscuit, brown, one ear slightly longer than the other from years of being held by it. Biscuit had been everywhere Zoe had been for 4 years. Camille was taking Zoe to Los Angeles. Her sister had called 3 weeks ago. Their father, 71, had been admitted to Cedars-Sinai. The word the doctors were using was treatable, but the way her sister said it carried the weight of everything that word is meant to cover. Camille had worked 3 extra shifts. She had called in a favor with her landlord about the rent date. She had found 2 seats on Flight 1149 that were in her budget. After a cancellation, opened a pair of first-class seats at a significant discount, a thing that happens rarely, a thing Camille took as a sign. She had booked them before she could talk herself out of it. She was going to see her father. Zoe was going to see her grandfather. That was all that mattered. Boarding began at 7:15. Richard Callow was first through the door. Richard had flown first class on this route 46 times. He knew the seat. He knew the routine. He knew exactly where the power outlet was relative to the window, and exactly how to arrange his bag to maximize elbow room. He settled into 2A the way a person settles into something they consider rightfully theirs, and he ordered a scotch before the seatbelt sign had been fully illuminated. He was on his phone. A deal, the word exclusivity, used several times. His voice carried into the row behind him and didn't care. He did not look up when Camille Okafor moved down the aisle with a sleeping 7-year-old over one shoulder and 2 carry-on bags on the other. Seats 2C and 2D, same row, across the aisle. Camille got Zoe settled with the careful, practiced efficiency of a single mother who has performed this maneuver in airports, restaurants, and pediatrician waiting rooms more times than she can count. Zoe stirred slightly. Her hand found Biscuit. She went back under. The flight attendant, whose name was James, offered Camille a pre-departure drink with a warmth that was genuine. He had watched her board and do the math immediately. He brought her a sparkling water without being asked twice and told her the flight was scheduled at 5 hours and 40 minutes. Smooth air most of the way, maybe a little weather over Denver. Camille thanked him. She exhaled for what felt like the first time since her sister called. Then Richard Callow looked up from his phone. He did it the way people do when something has entered their peripheral vision that doesn't match what they expected to see. His eyes moved to Camille, then to Zoe, then back to Camille, then across the aisle to the empty seat beside him, 2B, which was the last first-class seat to fill, and he seemed, in that moment, to be calculating something, running a private internal audit. The calculation did not take long. He pressed the call button. James appeared in 11 seconds. "Yes, Mr. Callow." Richard's voice dropped slightly. Not a whisper, a managed volume, the kind of volume that is designed to be heard by the person you are talking about. "Is this the right section?" He gestured, with the vagueness of someone who has practiced vagueness, in the direction of Camille and Zoe. James did not blink. "First class, yes, sir. All passengers are in their correct seats." "I just want to be sure," Richard said. "I've had experiences. Upgrades sometimes get mishandled." "Their tickets are confirmed, sir." Richard looked at James for a moment. Then he looked at Camille. Camille had heard every word. She was looking out the window. Her jaw was set. Her hand rested on Zoe's back, moving in the slow circle that keeps a child asleep, and she did not look at Richard Callow. Not because she hadn't heard him, because she had heard men like him her entire life, and had learned, the hard way, that looking at them was exactly what they wanted. James returned to the galley. He stood at the counter for a moment. He had worked for this airline for 11 years. He knew what had just happened. He also knew what the architecture of his position allowed him to do about it, which was not enough. He poured himself a cup of water and drank it, and decided to watch very carefully for the rest of this flight. The door sealed. The jet bridge retracted. Flight 1149 pushed back from gate 32 at 7:41, 7 minutes late. 12 minutes later, they were climbing through 8,000 feet, and Richard Callow had already begun. It started small, the way these things always start small. Richard summoned James twice in the first 30 minutes, once to complain that his scotch had been poured over the wrong ice. He preferred the larger cube, not the crushed, and once to ask whether the cabin could be made quieter. When James asked what specifically was bothering him, Richard looked across the aisle at Zoe, who had woken up and was playing a game on a tablet at the volume of a library, barely audible, and said, "The ambiance." James brought the correct ice. He did not address the ambiance. Zoe looked at the man across the aisle with the direct, unfiltered attention of a 7-year-old. "Hi," she said. Richard looked at her for a moment. He put his headphones on. Zoe looked at her mother. He didn't say hi back. "Some people don't," Camille said. She kept her voice easy, steady. "That's okay. You said hi. That's the part you can control." Zoe considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. She went back to her game. At the 2-hour mark, somewhere over Ohio, Richard Callow ordered his third scotch and made a phone call. The cabin was quiet, most passengers either sleeping or settled into the low attention state that a long flight produces. Richard spoke at his usual volume, which was the volume of a man who had stopped thinking about other people as recipients of noise approximately 20 years ago. The call was about an acquisition. A production company in Atlanta, black-owned, he noted with a particular inflection, as though this were a category that required special handling. He used phrases like cultural programming window and diversity quota content and the kind of thing that tests well but doesn't scale. His tone was the tone of a man rendering verdicts on things he had not studied. Camille heard every word. She did not move. Her hands were folded in her lap. Zoe was watching a movie now, headphones on, entirely elsewhere. Camille looked at the seat back in front of her and breathed the way she taught her patients to breathe when something was too much to hold all at once. James, passing through the cabin with a water service, heard 2 sentences of the call. He slowed his pace. He listened to 2 more. He moved to the galley and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the counter. He had a decision to make. He picked up the interphone. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Brooks was at 35,000 feet over the Ohio-Indiana border, monitoring a weather system that had developed over Colorado faster than the morning briefing had suggested. First Officer Dana Webb was running the updated routing numbers. The autopilot was on. The cockpit was the particular kind of quiet that is not silence, but the opposite of silence, full of information, full of attention, requiring nothing from either pilot except the readiness to act. The interphone chimed. Marcus picked up. "Brooks, Captain." It was James. His voice had the specific quality of a person choosing their words with precision. "I have a situation in first class I want to make you aware of. Passenger in 2A. Third drink in 2 hours. He made a comment on boarding that I documented. He is currently on a phone call that several rows can hear, and the content," James paused, "I'd describe it as creating a hostile environment for the passenger in 2C. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Has he directed anything at her directly?" "Not yet." "Is she distressed?" "She's managing it, sir, but there's a child." Marcus was quiet for another moment. Dana glanced at him. "I'll come back when I get a break in the weather picture," Marcus said. "Keep documenting. Don't escalate yet." "Yes, sir." Marcus put the interphone down. He looked at the radar. The weather cell over Colorado was tightening. He had 7 things to manage, and the capacity to manage all of them. He added Richard Callow to the list. The escalation happened at the 2-hour 40 mark. The flight had gone through a light round of turbulence over Indiana. Nothing serious. A few bumps. The seatbelt sign on for 4 minutes. Zoe had gripped Biscuit during it, and then, when it passed, announced to her mother that Biscuit had been scared, but she hadn't been. "Biscuit's very brave," Camille said. "I told him it was just clouds," Zoe said. The woman in 3A, who had been listening to this exchange over her book, made the small sound that people make when something delights them. Richard Callow did not find it delightful. He had been awake for 19 hours. The Scotch was not doing what Scotch usually did. The deal on the phone had gone sideways. The Atlanta production company had a different lawyer than expected, someone who knew the clause he was relying on, and the call had ended on an uncertain note. He was irritable in the deep, specific way of a man who is not used to things not going his way. He summoned James. "The child," he said when James arrived. He did not lower his voice. "Can you move them? I'm sorry." "The woman and the child across the aisle. Can you move them to another section? I'm trying to work." "Sir, the child hasn't exceeded normal cabin volume." "I'm not asking about volume. I'm asking about disruption. The whole," he gestured at the aisle, at Camille, at Zoe, at the general geography of their existence. "Situation is disruptive. I'm a platinum member. I have status. Surely there's something that can be done." James stood very still. "What specifically would you like done, Mr. Callow?" "Move them. Economy. Coach. Wherever they actually belong." The woman in 3A lowered her book. The man in 1B, who had been asleep, was not asleep anymore. Camille had gone completely still. Her hand was on Zoe's arm. Zoe had taken her headphones off, not because of what was being said, but because she could feel her mother's stillness, which, to a child who knows her mother, is a language unto itself. "Sir," James said, "I am not able to move confirmed first-class passengers to economy. Then I want to speak to whoever is in charge of this cabin." "That would be me, sir." Richard looked at him with the look of a man who has decided that the person in front of him is an obstacle rather than a human being. "Then get me the captain." James held his gaze for 1 full second. "I'll let the captain know you've requested to speak with him." He walked back to the galley. He picked up the interphone. Marcus Brooks was already reaching for it. Marcus unbuckled his harness at the 3-hour mark. "I've got the weather sorted," he told Dana. "Rooting around it. You have the aircraft." "I have the aircraft," Dana confirmed. Marcus put his hat on. He opened the cockpit door. He walked through the business section, through the brief curtained corridor, into first class. 11 rows, 22 seats. He had done this walk hundreds of times, sometimes for a medical situation, sometimes for a mechanical question a nervous passenger needed answered in person, once to mediate a dispute over a reclining seat that had escalated to a point requiring documentation. He had never done it for this. He stopped at the front of the first-class cabin. Richard Callow looked up. He saw the 4 stripes. He straightened. "Captain," Richard said, "finally, I have been trying to get satisfaction from your staff for the better part of 3 hours, and I—" "Mr. Callow," Marcus said. His voice was even and unhurried, and carried precisely as far as it needed to carry. "I've reviewed the documentation from this flight. I've listened to the interphone report from my lead attendant, and I'd like to ask you a direct question." He paused. "What exactly do you mean when you say these passengers don't belong here?" The cabin registered the question. The woman in 3A had fully lowered her book. The man in 1B was sitting forward. James stood at the galley entrance. Richard recalibrated. "I simply meant that the disruption—" "There has been no disruption," Marcus said. "My crew has documented your requests. The child has not exceeded normal volume at any point. The passenger across the aisle has been, by every account I have available, entirely within appropriate conduct." He paused again. "You, Mr. Callow, have made 3 complaints about the same passenger in 3 hours. I need to understand the specific nature of your objection." Richard's face was going through several colors. "I am a platinum member of this airline. I'm aware of your status, and I have the right to a comfortable flight experience." "You do. So does every other passenger on this aircraft, including the one you've asked me to remove from her confirmed seat." Silence. Richard leaned forward. His voice dropped to a register designed to be a confidence, a shared understanding between men of a certain standing. "Captain, I think you know what I'm saying. I think we both understand what this is about. I paid for a premium experience, and the composition of this cabin is—" "Stop." 1 word. Marcus said it the way a door closes, not slammed, just shut. Completely, finally, with no gap remaining. The cabin was entirely still. Zoe, who had been watching the large man in the uniform with the quiet, focused attention she brought to most things, reached over and put her hand in her mother's. Camille wrapped her fingers around it and did not look away from the window. Marcus spoke at a volume the entire cabin could hear. He did not raise it for effect. He simply no longer contained it. I've been flying for 28 years. I've carried grieving families and Olympic athletes, and soldiers coming home, and children going to see grandparents they've never met. I've flown through conditions that would stop your heart and delivered everyone safely to where they needed to be. I do that job without regard to who is sitting in which seat. Not because I'm required to, because that is what this job is. He looked at Richard directly. The passenger across the aisle from you is exactly where she is supposed to be. Her daughter is exactly where she is supposed to be. You made that difficult for them tonight. I need you to understand that clearly. Richard opened his mouth, closed it. Now, Marcus said, you have two options. You can spend the remainder of this flight without directing another complaint, comment, or communication toward that passenger or her daughter, and we land in Los Angeles and everyone goes home. Or you can continue, and I will divert this aircraft to Denver, where you will exit the plane under FAA authority, and this flight will continue without you. He paused. That's not a threat. Those are your actual options. No one in the cabin moved. James, at the galley entrance, was not breathing. The woman in 3A had pressed her lips together in a way that was the opposite of a smile, only because she was controlling it very carefully. Richard Callow looked at Marcus. He looked at the four stripes. He looked at the cabin around him, the faces that were very carefully not looking at him, which was its own kind of looking. He looked at his scotch glass, which was empty. He looked across the aisle at Camille Okafor, who was still looking out the window, her daughter's hand in hers. Then he looked back at Marcus. Understood, he said. It was quiet, clipped. The word of a man who has decided that the best remaining option is retreat. Marcus nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Callow. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit. He had taken 4 steps when Zoe's voice came from 2D. Excuse me? Marcus stopped. He turned. Zoe was looking at him with the directness that 7-year-olds deploy without apology. Biscuit was under her arm. Her mother was watching her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Yes, Marcus said. Are you the one who drives the plane? I am. Zoe considered this. So if you wanted to, you could just turn around and go back? I could. But you're not going to. No, we're going to Los Angeles. Zoe nodded. She seemed satisfied with this. My grandpa's there, she said. He's in the hospital. We're going to see him. Something moved through the cabin. Not a sound, a shift. The kind of thing that happens when a room full of strangers is suddenly reminded what they have in common. Then we better make sure we get there, Marcus said. Zoe nodded. She held up Biscuit. Biscuit says thank you. Marcus looked at the stuffed dog with the lopsided ears for a moment. Tell Biscuit he's welcome. He turned and walked back to the cockpit. Behind him, the woman in 3A made no attempt to control it anymore. The final 2 hours of Flight 1149 were quiet. Richard Callow sat in 2A. He did not summon James. He did not make any phone calls. He sat with his scotch glass empty in front of him and looked at the seat back and appeared, for the first time since Terminal 7, to be a man who had run out of things to say. James brought Zoe a cookie without being asked. Zoe asked if she could have 2. James said she could have 2. Zoe gave 1 to Biscuit and ate the other herself, a transaction she considered entirely fair. The woman in 3A, whose name was Patricia Chen, introduced herself to Camille over the armrest in the easy, unprompted way of someone who has decided that a situation calls for warmth. Patricia was a pediatric nurse at Cedars-Sinai, had been for 16 years. When Camille mentioned her father, Patricia asked which unit, listened carefully, and said that she knew the team there. Good people, she said. Your father is in good hands. Camille said, thank you. She said it in the way that people say things when they mean a great deal more than 2 words can carry. Somewhere over the Nevada desert, Zoe fell back asleep. She was curled into her seat, Biscuit pressed against her face, breathing the slow, unmistakable breath of a child who has decided the world is safe enough to let go of for a while. Camille watched the lights of Las Vegas slide past the window far below, a scatter of gold against the dark, and she felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has held themselves together through something difficult and is now, for the first time, permitted to notice how much it cost. She did not cry. She was not, at this moment, a person who cried in first class on an airplane, but she held Zoe's hand in the dark, and she looked at the lights below, and she let herself feel the full weight of where she was going and why, and she was grateful, in the specific way you are grateful for things you nearly didn't get, that they were on this plane. The cabin came to life in the particular way it does, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins opening, the general organized chaos of 212 people collectively remembering they had places to be. The intercom chimed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Brooks. We've arrived at Los Angeles International, local time 11:22. On behalf of First Officer Webb and the entire crew of Flight 1149, thank you for flying with us tonight. Please travel safely. A pause. And for those of you visiting someone in the hospital, I hope you find them doing better than you feared. No one who heard that didn't know who it was for. The woman in 3A, Patricia, looked at Camille. Camille was looking at the seat back ahead of her, and her jaw was set in the specific way of someone who is holding something together through sheer concentration, and her eyes were bright. The plane rolled to the gate. Richard Callow stood, retrieved his bag, and was first to the door. He did not look across the aisle. He did not say anything to Camille or to Zoe. He walked off the plane with his designer carry-on, and his expensive watch, and his $1,000 shoes, and he disappeared into the jet bridge, and for the moment, that is the last we see of him. Camille lifted a drowsy Zoe onto her hip. Biscuit dangled from Zoe's fist. Camille gathered her bags with her free hand and moved toward the door. James was there. He stopped at the jet bridge, James said quietly. He meant Marcus. He wanted to make sure you got off okay. Camille paused. She looked at James for a moment. Will you tell him something for me? Of course. Tell him we got off okay. James smiled. Yes, ma'am. Camille Okafor and her daughter Zoe arrived at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center at 12:40 in the morning. Her father, Emmanuel Okafor, was awake. He had been told they were coming. He was sitting up in the bed when they came through the door, his reading glasses on, a book face down on the blanket, and when Zoe ran to him with Biscuit under her arm and said, "Grandpa, Biscuit was scared on the plane, but I wasn't," Emmanuel Okafor laughed, a full, round, delighted sound, and held his granddaughter and looked at his daughter over the top of Zoe's head with the particular expression of a man who is counting his blessings out loud in a language that doesn't require words. Camille sat in the chair beside the bed. She took her father's hand. They stayed until 3 in the morning. As for Richard Callow, the man in 3A, a retired appellate court judge named Howard Greenberg, had been recording from the moment Captain Brooks walked into the cabin. Not with malicious intent, with the practiced instinct of a man who spent 30 years of his career knowing that documentation mattered. He had clean, complete audio of everything Richard said and everything Marcus said, from the first complaint to the final exchange. Howard posted it the following morning with a single caption, "What accountability sounds like." In 48 hours, it had 4 million views. Richard Callow's company issued a statement by noon on Wednesday. By Thursday, his position had been transitioned. By the following Monday, the Atlanta production company he had dismissed as diversity quota content had been contacted by 3 different streaming platforms offering real deals. Richard did not do an interview. He did not post a statement. His LinkedIn profile was removed. His name, which had been attached to a particular kind of power in a particular industry, became attached to something else entirely. A sound clip, a cabin, a captain's voice saying, "Stop," a 7-year-old asking a man in a uniform if he could turn the plane around. The industry moved forward. Richard stayed where he landed. I've thought about Flight 1149 a lot since March. Not about Richard Callow. I stopped thinking about him around the time we crossed into Nevada. I think about Zoe. I think about a 7-year-old girl on her way to see her grandfather in the hospital, holding a stuffed dog named Biscuit, asking me if I could turn the plane around. Not scared, not angry, just curious, just wanting to understand why the world was the way it was in that particular moment. I didn't have a great answer for her, but I've been flying long enough to know that the passengers who carry the most, the ones with the real weight, the real stakes, the real reasons they need to get somewhere, they're almost never the ones making noise. They're the ones sitting quietly, holding someone's hand, looking out the window at the lights below, trying to get to the person they need to see before it's too late. Those are the people I fly for. Those are the people this job is for. At 35,000 feet, the view is the same for everyone. No status changes what the sky looks like from up here. No platinum card changes what it means to be trying to get home. Character is the only thing that separates us. And character, Marcus looks directly at camera, always shows up eventually, one way or another. Safe travels, everyone. I'll see you on the next flight.